Sarah, you're on. If you could do a welcome, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to ADAO's 10th Zoom conversation. We'll get started in just a few minutes, but in the meantime, we're asking everyone to please mute themselves and turn off your cameras for the duration of the conversation. We just want to maximize the amount of information that we'll be sharing, so only Linda and our speakers will be using the video and microphone function. If you do have a question, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Nicole and I will be trying to monitor that, and we'll take any questions at the end. And please look out for a recap email after today's conversation. And with that, I am very excited to introduce our three speakers: Linda Reinstein, co-founder and president of ADAO; Dr. Celeste Monforton, author, lecturer, and ADAO's Prevention and Scientific Advisory Board liaison; and Mark Caitlin, former Occupational Health and Safety Director for the Service Employees International Union and Prevention Advisory Board member. Today, we're going to discuss how asbestos has and continues to impact workers and their families, legacy asbestos in the workplace, and collective action to ban asbestos. And with that, I will turn it over to Linda.
So good morning to everyone. I'm going to make sure that you guys can see my screen. I'm seeing a lot of friends online, but also a lot of new faces. As Sarah said, this is our 10th Zoom event, and we're so happy to have these experts join us. And it's international as well. I know Marie-Claude from France will be joining, and many others. So as Sarah went through with a little bit of housekeeping, if you'll hang with me for 1 second, we are going to record this. So if you give me a second, we will be good to go, and we are recording. Okay. I'm going to ask that one of my interns tells me that yes, the screen sharing is working. Everyone can see it. So it is our 10th conversation, and Celeste and Mark are dear, dear friends, colleagues, and experts in the field. I know everyone will walk away with a greater sense of learning, and that is what we're all about. For those of you who I haven't personally met, I am Linda Reinstein, the co-founder of ADAO. I'm also a mesothelioma widow. When Doug Lark and I co-founded ADAO back in 2004, we knew that with the devastation our families were suffering from our loved ones' diagnosis, that if we brought education, advocacy, and community together, we could work to prevent exposure to eliminate all asbestos-caused diseases. And that's what we've done for the last 17 years. This is a kind of a wordy slide, but I put it in the PowerPoint on purpose so that those who come on board to watch this at a later date can see what is asbestos, where might it be, and what do I do? And that's what you're going to learn today from Celeste and Mark through some historical aspects, but also what's happening now. All of our work is made possible, and we are very grateful to our sponsors and individual donors. Today, we actually have Perry Browder from Simmons Hanley Conroy on board, and we're thankful they have rejoined us as a platinum sponsor. We also have the Gorey Law Firm, and Sarah's on board as well today. Our silver sponsor this year is the Early, Lucarelli, Sweeney, and Meisenkoten Law Firm. And as those of you who know us, we do not make legal referrals, but these firms feel our work is so important, they're willing to put up dollars to make our work possible, and ADAO is very grateful. So this is going to be we're going to pause for just a second here. I would like to spend a few minutes where Mark and Celeste introduce themselves. So I know you guys so well. We have all great kinds of stories and secrets, but for the group, could you please, Mark, introduce yourself? You got to unmute yourself, Mark.
Thank you so much. It really is wonderful to be here, and thanks so much, Linda, for sponsoring this and ADAO. So I'm an industrial hygienist. I've just completed my 40th year in this profession, doing occupational safety and health work here in the U.S. Asbestos was an issue that I ran into early in my career in the early 80s, and I've been dealing with asbestos issues ever since. And we'll talk more about some of that later. But one of the things that came about because of my asbestos work was I was involved in lots of training of workers because of laws and regulations from EPA and OSHA. And in the late 1990s, I was doing so much of that training, I was looking for other ways to help highlight the information. And I started finding historical films, of which we're going to look at some in the presentation. So that evolved into actually a YouTube channel of historical occupational health and safety films, many of which discuss the issue of asbestos. So currently there's more than 1,000 films on my YouTube channel, and we'll see a couple here today.
And Mark, just so people are going to be really intrigued by your historical videos, we will do a wrap up. Sarah, Nicole, and I are working on that. That will have links to this PowerPoint, your video, Celeste's book, and all kinds of great stuff, and how they can help us. So wonderful. Celeste, do your intro, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm Celeste Monforton. I'm a lecturer in public health at Texas State University, where I teach classes in environmental and occupational health. Prior to my formal training in public health, I worked for 11 years at the U.S. Department of Labor in Washington, D.C. I was at OSHA during the time, mid-90s, when they issued revisions to its asbestos standard for the construction industry. And then I later worked at the Mine Safety and Health Administration for the Assistant Secretary. And I remember one night I answered the phone after hours, and then the other end of the line was a reporter from the Seattle Post-Intelligencer named Andrew Snyder. And Andrew wanted to talk to my boss, David McAteer, to find out why our inspectors had never found asbestos at a vermiculite mine in Libby, Montana. And what Andrew described to us was really hard to believe, but all of it was true. And so that call took MSHA and took me personally down a path that was very hard to believe. But I just think many things related to asbestos are hard to believe. Its profound carcinogenicity, how it's indestructible, industry's disregard for people's lives, and our country's failure to ban it. It's all just pretty unbelievable. I first met Linda in 2009 at an event hosted by OSHA's newly appointed Assistant Secretary at the time, David Michaels. And as Linda said, I'm privileged to work with her as a volunteer with ADAO. I'm also a longtime member of the American Public Health Association. And in 2009, and again in 2019, with Linda and Barry Castleman and some others, APHA adopted a policy statement that called on Congress to ban asbestos, since EPA has been unwilling to do that. And also just to mandate a study that would help us understand in the US the prevalence of asbestos in homes and schools and buildings and other structures. And then finally, in 2019, I had the privilege of testifying on behalf of the American Public Health Association in strong support of the Allen Reinstein Ban Asbestos Now Act. And that bill faced tough adversaries, but you can be sure that APHA and ADAO and the firefighters and other allies, we will be fighting mightily this year to get Congress to pass a ban on asbestos.
So everyone, you can see how important Mark and Celeste are, not only to ADAO, but to workers in the US and around the world. So for those of you who follow ADAO's work and possibly other labor organizations, we just honored and remembered workers on Workers' Memorial Day on April 28th, and there'll be more to that. So when we're thinking about this presentation, about what have we done to prevent occupational exposure to asbestos and legacy, etc., it is important to know every number that you read about is a face and belongs to a family member. So Mark, you have the most amazing collection of historical videos, and I always say that history is a great teacher to those who's listening. I don't know if our lawmakers are always listening, but let's play your first clip, and let me see if I can do this in the AOK fashion. We're going to play Mark's 1930 video, and hopefully, is there sound, Mark?
There's not sound, and so this is actually a video from the U.S. Bureau of Mines in collaboration with Johns Mansfield Corporation, and there was 100 years ago they began collaboration of the Bureau of Mines and Industry to basically promote their industries and products around the world. And this is one of the sort of PR films that came out of that. So these are now available at the U.S. National Archives. So they're showing the use of asbestos material and asphalt on built-up roofing. This roofing was used widely up until the 1980s and even 1990s. And so we still have we still have legacy asbestos in roofing on many older buildings that have been both originally built or remodeled since. So here the asbestos containing felts.
It's pretty unbelievable, and I'm sure Celeste has something to say when you see, especially with public health, these workers, no PPE, no clothing, no rules, no OSHA standard, because that was about 40 years later. But you can take a moment and see how these workers actually were put in danger because of the industry. Mark, I think it's interesting. I don't know if you've ever tallied up how many of these historical videos actually have a stamp or a logo of our government. Does this one have a U.S. Involvement, collaboration?
Oh yeah, there are at least 3 films that were made with the U.S. Bureau of Mines, and Johns Mansfield over the years to sort of highlight and promote the use of asbestos products. And so, in the film in the 1930s, the evidence shows that clearly the industry knew that asbestos exposure could cause asbestosis, one type of lung disease. As we go into the last film in 1959, a lot of the diseases were already associated with exposure to asbestos in the workplace.
Yeah, so before we start that one, for anybody with a pencil and paper, you might want to take down a note that we knew in the early 1900s that asbestos exposure would cause suffering, disease, and death. So when you see this, I hope you feel the rage and anger that I might feel as a widow, and of course public health officials, that the government and industry knew. Celeste, is there anything after the roofing video that you want to pop in before we play the 1959?
So I just want to say that it's really obvious the high exposures that the workers in that film were, and what we have this situation now is the consequence of those exposures, and we still have people exposed, and many times they don't even realize that they're being exposed.
So Mark and Celeste, this next video is also important, but Mark, from an SEI former point of view, SEIU, and Celeste from APHA, as well as MSHA, how would you guys like to define asbestos legacy for the viewers that we have on this PowerPoint? Mark, you want to go first?
Sure, and I think what you'll see in this film is going to discuss a large number of uses of asbestos products products that Johns Mansfield made and the government was promoting, and so we see why a lot of these products are things that are still around. And so the legacy exposure means that workers in various work sites, whether it's schools, public buildings, other places, can inadvertently run into this if it's not known to be present and precautions aren't taken. And so the further we get away from the 1980s, when there was a lot of work with OSHA and EPA and asbestos, the memory of this from both owners and workers seems to be disappearing, and there's a lot more chance for exposures to this legacy asbestos.
Excellent. Celeste, you want to give us a modern day connection to legacy asbestos?
Yeah, so the modern day connection is just what Mark said, the legacy of all of that material that's there. The other part of it is putting the faces and the names and the families, the legacy of death and grief that that has occurred. And until we take care of this problem, that legacy of death and mourning and grief will just continue.
So we think, and there was a Surgeon General, Mark and Celeste, you probably remember, it could have been conference 2014 or something. We had, it was wonderful. We had the acting Surgeon General, Boris, I'm trying to remember his last name. I just had brain fade. Anyway,
Lashenko.
Thank you. So Boris gave a riveting PowerPoint and keynote speech, but he used a line that we still use at ADAO: asbestos is not a thing of the past. Now, I'm going to run this clip of Mark's video. We will stop it about 1.5 minutes in. I want you to know that every video that we're seeing today will go in the email that Sarah and Nicole and I are writing. So don't feel like you're missing out on something. So let's run this video, Mark. 1959, asbestos industrial use. And the title of the video is Asbestos, a Matter of Time.
And there is sound.
Asbestos improves in many ways the industrial equipment that makes the countless products we use daily. Asbestos felts help shield the thousands of miles of gas and oil transmission lines against corrosion. The basis of practically every industrial process is heat. On process pipelines and equipment across the nation, asbestos insulations, by conserving heat, reduce industry's fuel bill by hundreds of millions annually. Indeed, it has been progress in asbestos insulation, withstanding higher and higher temperatures, that has helped make possible many of the new processes and new products that improve our daily living. The motive power of industry is also conserved by asbestos. Pumps, compressors, tools, all kinds of reciprocating, oscillating, and rotating equipment operate more efficiently because of asbestos packing. And asbestos gaskets prevent the escape of fluids and gases from a wide variety of pressure vessels. Asbestos friction materials control motion, withstanding the heat, shock, and strain of braking, holding and releasing the drums of cranes, drills, dredges, and other heavy equipment.
And there's the closing with the U.S. Bureau of Mines, and then in conjunction with Johns Mansfield.
So it's pretty shocking to know our government collaborated with one of the leading manufacturers of asbestos contaminated products, but that's where we are. And Mark, I think that's an excellent video on a lot of points. Legacy for ADAO is obviously, it's about the asbestos that is in homes, schools, buildings, and workplaces, but it is more than that. With climate change, we are seeing structures that are contaminated being, obviously they're destroyed, implode, need repair. And when there's a fire, those workers and residents are often exposed. And I bring up fires because Celeste, as she mentioned, I think in our pre-warm-up, I was contacted by CBS News in Austin, Texas late yesterday. And a reporter asked if I'd go on and just on the record and talk about asbestos from just an quick 35,000 feet. So what the story is in Austin, Texas, about a week ago, there was a warehouse fire. The building is owned by the city. It was rented to a movie crew for storage. And on the last day of the contract, whatever, that building went up in smoke. 115 firefighters were called to the site to fight the fires. And I love firefighters and the unions that represent them. And those workers, those firefighters may very well have been exposed to asbestos. What's also behind the story is there was a group of homeless people in the area. And I'm sure that no one's going to capture who they are, where is their doctor, do we need any conversation with the physician? There's a lot of lost people, as Celeste and Mark know, that get exposed along the way that aren't reflected in statistics. So we've talked a little bit about the unions. Let's talk about worker centers. Celeste, will you educate and share, please?
Yeah, thank you so much, Linda. I actually have I had the honor of being able to write over the last 2 years a book that's called The Untold Story of Worker Centers and the New Fight for Wages, Dignity, and Health, and it's published by the New Press. And worker centers, in a nutshell, are community labor organizations where workers can come together, particularly those who are immigrants or workers of color, mostly in low-wage jobs, where they can learn about their rights and develop strategies to try to improve working conditions. So these are individuals who are day laborers, house cleaners, janitors, landscapers, who are often taken advantage of because of their immigration status or the status of people who live in their households. And it's the kind of thing like an unsafe job is better than no job at all when you have to pay the rent. And so my first experience with a worker center was at a worker center in Houston called Fe Justicia, Faith and Justice Worker Center. And at the time, their office was in the upstairs, a little room in the upstairs of St. Stephen's Episcopal Church. And there were little drawings from kids from Sunday school that say things like love your neighbor and be kind. But I got involved because two workers, Luis Matute and Abraham Polanco, had been working on a project that was contracted by the city of Houston to repair rupturing water lines, water mains. There were 700 of them in 1 week that were rupturing because it was this huge drought. And so all the soil around, the city was just cracking, and so were the water mains. And Luis and Abraham became really suspicious of the pipes that they were working on. They were plumbers by training. They were from Honduras and were very familiar with asbestos cement because it was a common roofing material in their hometowns. And they raised concerns about the asbestos cement pipe and how they were, and other workers were dry cutting the pipe, but they were ignored. They were also ignored about getting paid, but that's a whole different story. So I came into the picture because the director of the Worker Center contacted me and said, you know about occupational health, maybe you can, talk with these workers. Next thing I know, Linda flew down to Houston, and Luis and Abraham took us on a sleuthing tour around Houston. They showed us all the different job sites, areas where they were working, mostly in neighborhoods where these repair jobs were being done. And it was really hard to believe at first what they were telling us, but I really should never have doubted them. And that's something that I've learned over the years. Never doubt workers, is knowing being the experts of what's going on. So here's a photo of Linda and I talking with Luis and Abraham. I think, Linda, we spent 3 days with them.
We did.
That's my shoe in front of one of the asbestos cement pipes. And this is a pile of asbestos cement pipes that was just just in a neighborhood. It was, and that's where I took the photo. It was really, really unbelievable. We collected samples of the pipes just to confirm what Luis and Abraham had already taken some samples and sent them off to a lab on their own. We found that the cement was a 35% mix of chrysotile and crucidolite asbestos mixed in with the pipe. With the help of the worker centers, and Luis and Abraham being willing to tell their story, we filed an OSHA complaint. We met with the city council, and these are the kind of things that worker centers do. They're very good at helping workers develop the capacity to talk about their situation, to stand up for their rights, and to make an example of companies and lawmakers who fail to protect workers. And I'll just conclude by saying that I never had so many people contact me and say, our water pipes have asbestos in them. And I think that this is also an example of what we can foresee with extreme weather events, with climate change, with tornadoes, with fires, with hurricanes, that workers, particularly vulnerable workers like these two men, are the ones who will often be called in to clean up people's homes, to clean up businesses, and we will be exposing a whole nother wave of individuals to asbestos unless we make the effort to have a national assessment of where all of this asbestos is located. This can be done in a very sophisticated way with GIS mapping, with historical records. We could map the country and have a circle around the regions of different cities of where we would expect asbestos to be. So that information can go to workers, it can go to teachers, janitors, and certainly firefighters like the ones in Austin last week that were exposed to asbestos as well. If you see the video, you see the smoke just billowing out of that building, and I can't help but think, about the fibers that potentially were being, disseminated around the neighborhood there.
You're so right. And when we talk about a study, it's important to reflect back on the Alan Reinstein Ban Asbestos Now Act of 2019 that had amazing support from labor, attorneys general, public health communities that we'll have to obviously start again. But it's a human rights and violation, and also shows environmental human rights violations and environmental racism, because these workers, my daughter actually came down and was our translator. When you can't speak English and don't have access to a union and possibly have limited technology at home, they are the vulnerable population. These pipes that happened to be in this area, not far from there, I believe it was former President Bush living in the area, and they were replacing pipes, cement pipes with plastic. So we look at, if we can't mitigate and eliminate the exposure risk, why on earth are we allowing industry to import over 300 metric tons last year of raw asbestos? It's outrageous. Celeste, you've done great work. I'm so excited to share. You have a new book. Tell us about it.
Well, my book is about worker centers. I wanted to learn more about them. And my co-author, Jane Von Bergen, and I, we traveled to 12 different worker centers around the country. Our book features those worker centers, stories from each of those worker centers, very much driven by the voices and the stories of the workers. And we do some comparisons, what are the relationship between worker centers and unions, the important role that worker centers are having in health and safety, and some of the campaigns that have been very successful by worker centers in changing city laws and also state laws. So that's what the book is about. Thanks for the plug.
Yeah, I will put it in our wrap-up email so people can take a look at your amazing work and hopefully buy your book. Mark, is there anything with the Houston example that Celeste beautifully set up that you'd like to comment on from a union perspective or as an industrial hygienist?
Yeah, well, having worked for unions most of my 40 years and having run into asbestos so often there are specific regulations that are in many work sites that are covered by either EPA in schools or by OSHA and other types of work sites, where employers are actually required to at least have an idea where the asbestos is and to inform workers and outside contractors and others, so that so that the purpose is to try to prevent these sort of exposures. And those laws, regulations are still on the books. To a great extent, it seems like they're being forgotten, ignored, and if they were simply being followed, it would help us to a great deal. And so these workers that Celeste described, there should have been a system in place to alert them and have proper procedures in place when they were doing their jobs to prevent their exposures. And then we know how to do this. It's not extremely difficult. We just have to know it. We have to know they're there. We have to know how to change jobs to make them safer.
One of the things I'll add about that is, as I started to explore this in Houston, just trying to find out where in the city where were these pipes laid. I spent so much time at the Central Library in Houston, and that information just isn't available, or no one's taken the time to compile it. So one, it's a failure of the city to know where it is or map it out in some way. And then two, as you say, Mark, even if you don't have if the contractors didn't have that, as soon as you start that job site and you see the pipe isn't a steel pipe or whatever, that they have the responsibility to assess that and then take the precautions if it is in fact asbestos cement pipe. So failings across the board. And that's where it's really important for the workers to know what their rights are, know what the regulations are, and not be afraid of losing their jobs if they speak up about the problem.
That's
right. Yeah. I'm sorry, and that was a big part of organized labor's fight to win a lot of these protections, because unionized workers are more protected if they speak up, and you often know that. These unorganized workers takes a great courage to speak up and maybe lose your job.
Very true. So for those of you who follow ADAO, in 2006, I believe, Celeste will straighten me out if I'm wrong, there was a group of 10 individuals working for the federal government underneath the Capitol, and they worked for the architect of the Capitol, and they were exposed to asbestos. And Mark, you probably remember this too. these workers stood up, spoke out, then they were smacked as whistleblowers and ultimately were pulled out of the tunnels. I think 8 out of 10 of them had exposure, and their physicians documented. John Thayer was a very brave, he was a supervisor at the time, and he said he was never alerted to the fact that his lung age was of that of a man who was 117 years old. So maybe one of the things we put in is about the Capitol tunnel workers. At the end, they as tunnel workers were not allowed to sue the government because of legal things. And of course, Perry and Sarah could correct me, but it is important to hold those who have caused disease, suffering, and deaths responsible, because that is sort of a Clarence Burrell story. If we don't take them to court, no one does this because they're Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts and they feel it's the right thing. They do it because they're held responsible. And when these cases get worked up, we, ADAO, I go back and read case documents because of the lawyers doing forensic discovery. We learned who manufactured those gaskets, Mark, in your tape, and where are these worker centers and where are these workers exposed. So hold those companies responsible. At the end, we just want to prevent all exposure to eliminate all diseases. Celeste, I'm so excited. I expect a signed copy in the mail sometime soon. I'm so proud of you. There was a point of this 3-day trip that Celeste and I and my daughter, we went around to other communities looking for people digging, and we actually pretended like we were asking dumb questions, I think, and they were telling us that they thought it was asbestos, but they really didn't know, and they didn't care because it took a long time. And there was a long story about Houston, which we'll have to share. Let's keep going because I don't want to run out of time. This video is important. And Mark, set this up for us because sadly, many people probably have never heard of Mr. Sweeney, but if you'd like to set this up, we'll play this last video of yours.
Sure. So this is a video from 1983, and this is actually an internal video produced by the Service Employees International Union to educate their local leaders about the need to deal with asbestos, and the union beginning in collaboration with many other unions and organizations a fight in the 80s to try to prevent exposure to asbestos, ultimately to have it banned. And so Mr. Sweeney was the president of the Service Employees International Union, which represented almost 1 million workers across the country, mostly in service sector work sites, in janitors in schools and janitors in hospitals and lots of other buildings. And so I think let's hear what he has to say about this, and then I can follow up a little bit after it's over.
Great. There's sound, right, Mark?
Yes.
When I became aware of asbestos in our schools, I asked several of our department heads to work with the research department and our public relations agency to try to determine the full extent of the problem, not only with regard to our members who work in schools, but with regard to school children in general and with other categories of SEIU members. Quite frankly, I had been under the impression, as I suspect many of you may be, that our problems with asbestos were taken care of 10 years ago, when we all discovered what a killer it can be. We have now learned enough to know that that isn't the case.
That's a pretty shocking clip, Mark. Do you want to follow up with a comment?
Yeah, so John Sweeney was shocked because he thought asbestos was dealt with in the 70s, when there was a lot of attention focused on it with OSHA and EPA coming into place. What he learned was that janitors in schools were being shown to have excessive levels of asbestosis and some other asbestos-related diseases, and he then put the union on a multi-year campaign to both press EPA and OSHA to deal with asbestos better. That resulted in the Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act, a HERA of 1986, and also part of it also led to the attempt to ban asbestos in 1989, which was partially successful but not completely. And I know that's part of what ADAO is trying to finish up. But by the end of the 80s, many of us in occupational health thought that we had, to a great extent, dealt with the asbestos problem, that the legacy asbestos that was still there would be dealt with, controlled worker exposure dealt with over time, and that by the time we got here 20, 30 years later, that this would be a historical disease, and that's not been the case. We're still seeing 1,000 around 1,000 workers a year with asbestosis. We're seeing lots of mesothelioma cases. We have lung cancer cases, and the exposures seem to be not getting better. It feels in some ways like it's getting worse. People are forgetting about it.
I think you're right. I'm waiting for Celeste to put her camera back on. So while we wait for Celeste, oh, there she is. I think that the timeline of your historical videos, Mark, is so important for everyone on this call and who views this video later on to recognize that this is a century-old problem and we're not even close to fixing it. Celeste, after you watched the video with John Sweeney, what would you like to comment on?
Well, I thought it was really interesting because, you know, I am focused with some of my colleagues in the worker health and safety movement that this is the 50th anniversary of the year that OSHA opened its doors. And the very first standard that the agency issued was on asbestos. The agency opened its doors April 28th, 1971, and by December it had issued an emergency standard on asbestos. And the language of the Federal Register notice is so different from what we read today. I mean, it actually had emotion and passion in it. And, you know, there's words like, you know, that these are undisputed grave consequences, you know, related to asbestos. And one phrase in there is lives of employees are at risk. Like, we just we don't talk about hazards that way anymore. You know, it's all kind of like p-values and all that kind of nonsense. And we've washed away what it means to put in place public health protections. And I also noticed, Linda, that you have the Death on the Job cover of the AFL-CIO's annual report. And I just want to tip my hat and give my thanks to Rebecca Reindell and MK Fletcher for putting this report together, you know, led off 30 years ago by Peg Seminario. And it is just a amazing resource compilation of all the health and safety data, and, you know, just table after table of injury rates and broken down by different occupations and different industries. And then it also has state-by-state profiles. So you can see, you know, what the fatality rates on each state, how many inspectors they have, what the penalties are for OSHA violations. So it's a really good resource, and it also can help us realize that there's data available out there. So, I mean, if someone wanted to dig into the data of like how many asbestos violations are issued every year, what are the penalties for those asbestos violations, that kind of data isn't in this report, but it does tell you that that kind of data is available if one were interested in looking at that and putting that together. And I think we probably would find there were many more asbestos inspections and violations issued in the past than are issued today.
I think when I've testified in front of Congress, oh, sorry, Mark, 1 second, that I have told members of Congress that it is cheaper to do it wrong and pay the fine than to do it correctly. And that seems to be reprehensible. Mark, what were you going to say?
Well, I think that you're right, and Celeste is correct in terms of the inspections. One of the things that when I look back historically, that the successes that we thought we had in the 80s, which a lot of it revolved around really good worker training through their unions or universities or other ways, so that the workforce that was dealing with asbestos, both janitors, maintenance workers in buildings, and then construction workers doing abatement work, that they would be well trained, and that was going to be the eyes and ears to protect both workers and the public. And to a great extent, what we've seen is that system seems to have fallen away over time. But the regulatory agencies, OSHA and EPA, have tended to just assume that because of that historical training was supposed to be in place, that they don't have to be doing the inspections and they don't have to be doing the oversight that we expected them to keep doing. So it's sort of the worst of both worlds. Workers aren't being protected by the agencies set up to protect them, and the training they were supposed to get so they would even know to call the agencies has also fallen apart. And so because of that, we just need to emphasize both the need to ban existing uses of asbestos and really deal with the legacy uses, or we're going to not get past the asbestos disease sort of epidemic that's rolling through our country and around the world.
True. Celeste, did you have a comment?
I did, but it went out of my head.
Welcome to my world. When we talk about workers and exposure, I'd like everyone on this call to broaden their thinking, that it's not just the worker who has been in possibly in a trench digging up a cement pipe like Luis and others. They walk home, they go home to their family, and there's a deadly hug component where the spouse may wash their clothing, the children may hug them. And Celeste and Mark, over the years of being involved with my work, they've met Mike Mattmuller, they've met Michael Bradley. These young men died, and they did not, I believe, I'm not sure, I don't want to discuss their cases, it could be still ongoing litigation, but young people get sick and die, and they have not worked for 60 years, you know, in a trench. And I think it's very important to look at the environmental, the occupational exposure. Take-home exposure is a real thing. They call it para-occupational sometimes. I call it a deadly hug. And those companies should be held responsible for not only impacting the worker, but the worker's family. Okay, let's touch on this bill because it's getting me a little hot in the center part. We worked so hard, and Celeste was there all the way through, and Mark, so were you, and many others on this call. We were almost there. November 2019, 47-1. It was woo-woo. It was pop the champagne. We've almost got a bill that can go to the floor of the House and the Senate. And we're going to get this done. And yes, President Trump will sign it into law. He would have to. Well, we didn't get the job done, but we are back at the table. We don't have anything to share as of yet, other than the fact that Representative Bonamici and Senator Merkley remain champions to protect not only their constituents in Oregon, but the nation and, of course, the world. This sends a big message. Mark and Celeste, this is a chance. Do you want to touch on the bill, or do you have a message to Congress? It can be both things. It doesn't have to be either or.
I can just say that just like in the previous Congress, the American Public Health Association just is such a strong proponent and supporter of the simple provisions that are in this bill. Stop the import of asbestos, have reasonable reporting requirements, and also this very important study so that firefighters and everyone in the public knows you know, where asbestos is located, if asbestos is located in their communities. And I just think that is just so important when we are calling on firefighters to go in and fight blazes. They need to know that before they go in there, because as Linda and I talked this morning, you know, maybe you don't need to save that old warehouse and fight that fire. Just let it, you know, burn to the ground. And with more disasters, you know, people need to know that. And so I'm trying to feel very positive that we can get off on the right foot and that we can have a bill that quickly moves through the Congress. I don't think that firefighters or anyone should have to wait any longer for that.
Well said. Mark,
Yeah.
What about you?
And I agree. I would add that from having been around in the 80s and the early 90s, when there was a lot of effort to control asbestos in the U.S. to protect both lots of workers and the public, that it's just tragic that we didn't finish the job back then, that Congress didn't finish the job back then. And I think it'd be really, we were a world leader in controlling asbestos, and now we're way behind in the U.S. It'd be really good to have Congress finish this part of the job of banning the use of asbestos and deal with the legacy issue, so we make this a true historical disease in the coming decades.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one. When we talk about firefighters, I want to include in the wrap-up email the 2013 NIOSH firefighter study, 3 cohorts, San Francisco, Chicago, and I believe Philadelphia, and they determined with the study that firefighters develop mesothelioma at twice the rate as the rest of the population. So structural exposure is important. Firefighters is a clean cohort that they could study, but how many other people have fallen under the radar with the fires in California, the hurricanes in Houston, the new fires, Celeste, in Austin, that you just wrote your memoirs about? the death toll of 40,000 Americans every year is probably still very low. And these are all preventable asbestos caused deaths.
I'm also thinking about, here in Texas, the housing boom is crazy. And I think it's elsewhere. People are buying all kinds of homes, including older homes. And, I just really have a fear about, renovations and do-it-yourselfers, and, so that's another concern, and why more education, and the investment by our federal government in leadership on that, that there has to be investment in recognizing where the asbestos is and getting that information out into the communities. And whether that's done through, the health departments, or, through county government or permitting agencies, I don't really care how it's done. I just think it needs to be done.
So,
and I have I have a real concern, just as an example of kind of what might be coming, is the recent COVID relief bill that Congress passed has more than $100 billion for schools to deal with COVID infectious disease issues, which is really wonderful. But there may be a lot of that work involving ventilation systems, and that'll be getting into the infrastructure inside of schools, and that could very likely be disturbing asbestos that's still in place, the legacy asbestos in drywall and other parts of the schools. That asbestos, if it's not controlled, will both expose the workers, the contractors, the school workers, educators, and potentially children if it's not done properly. And it's not an issue that I've seen been mentioned or discussed much, but $100 billion plus to do infrastructure work needs to be done carefully and needs to be done following the existing rules and regulations.
well,
Linda, I'm wondering if you could refresh our memory on the study that was done. I think it was in the Senate. One of the members requested a study, or they did a study about a HERA and like the lack of enforcement. Can you refresh our memory about that? Because I think it ties in really well with what Mark is saying. Is there's like a whole generation now that doesn't have this experience with.
So that's a great point. We might have to put that also in the wrap up. So thank you for reminding me, because that was a 2015 Senator Boxer, Senator Markey's study about asbestos in schools. And what those senators did, and they actually sent me the preliminary questions, is I think it was probably about 40 questions or so, went out to every governor. And then they asked about how they were handling asbestos in their schools, HERA, et cetera. And I believe only 3 states responded. Everybody for the most part, got a failing grade. Celeste is a professor. You know what that looks like on a document. So our schools didn't take it. This is my interpretation. I think states didn't take the study seriously enough. And what we've seen is that if parents don't challenge schools, and it is their right as a parent. I don't know if Toby's on this Zoom, because she's very active in Canada. She's remarkable. She is holding schools responsible for asbestos and whether or not it's abated, and protecting children. And you have to think about children, the students, the parents, the staff, the residents in the community. It's not one group. And the American Federation of Teachers is a remarkable union. I love working with them. And I know Randy Weingarten will not be a silent president when this goes forward. But we like with Mark and you, Celeste, feel it is very important that the right people get the contracts to do the infrastructure work in schools, or we will face what we did in Orange County. They hired a company, they did a poor job. And I remember I was called down to Orange County, it was 3 schools in the district. Parents were sobbing, because you cannot take that experience away with an I'm sorry. That means, and I know Perry and Sarah on this call, they can't so-called work up a case, I guess might be their language, but if you're not sick, you don't have a case. In Brazil, there are psychological damages. Like, it is terrifying to think that you could be exposed and get sick. And these are real exposures in modern day, but these companies are not responsible because someone's not sick yet. And if I asked you, Celeste, Mark, what did you have for breakfast 2 weeks ago? You'd probably look like me, like, I don't know, unless it was coffee. These are the questions that somebody who is sick will have to answer, is all about their occupational, their medical history. And if you're a homeless person and you were exposed, are you going to be able to seek civil justice in the same way that somebody from an urban area is? And it's shattering to me personally.
Yeah.
And we also need to think about, you know, I would hope we would get to a point where we wouldn't have to be suing. We would want to be preventing, you know.
Right.
I think, you know, the compassion that the attorneys have who represent these families and these victims, I think that they, you know, at some point, they don't want to have those cases anymore, because we don't want to have them. We want to be preventing those exposures.
Well, and that's really important because of the latency effect of especially some of the with mesothelioma, where that disease may show up 30, 40 years after the exposure. And so, you know, we're already projecting how far in the future we may be seeing disease because of what's happening today. And it's really disturbing.
Both of you are absolutely right. Our dear friend and colleague, Pat Morrison, who's a health and safety director under the president at the International Association of Firefighters, has done, I think, 5 or 6 of our staff briefings in Congress. And when we're organizing this briefing, obviously home office, it's never easy. But Pat will be calling in from like Hurricane Katrina, all these different disaster sites because of climate change. And the firefighters, are on the front lines all the time. And we, as Americans and our government, owe hardworking Americans a study about where legacy asbestos is. Is it in my pipes? Is it in my home or school or workplace? What about that Superfund site? There's a whole new study that's gone on where the study it was discussing the fact that the caps may not hold on Superfund sites. And we know that that is true because we've gone to Ambler, Pennsylvania, and we picked up debris with erosion and time. We can't manage the risk of asbestos. So we must do what you, Mark, and Celeste have said, is stop imports and use. One last slide before we go to opening up some questions. I would like to invite everyone on this Zoom call to be our guest. There will be no fee. You'll be invited to attend our conference, virtual conference on the 18th. And we can do this thanks to our sponsors, Simmel Hanley Conroy, the Gorey Law Firm, and Early Lucarelli, Sweeney, and Meisencone. We can offer everyone on this call a free admission to our virtual conference. And write this down, there's going to be a special event on Friday. It's going to be art, advocacy, and shared stories. And Earl Daughter is on this call now. You only see his name. He's been an amazing partner that has allowed ADAO to bring out some of the human aspects of this man-made disaster with his posters, brilliant posters. We'll have to include that, Sarah and Nicole, also in the email. But we're going to have a film night on Friday, Yahoo to videos and film. And we're going to feature 2 movies and a short and have a filmmaker set up and a conversation and really bring in the art and advocacy that puts the truth behind this man-made disaster. So I'm very excited. So watch for that. But you're on my special guest list. Gosh, we're not going to have a lot of time for questions. So Mark, what would you like? I think we should really speak to Congress because it's time. Do you have a message that you would like to give to Congress?
Yeah, I just think this needs to get resolved, and this needs to just get done. We need to stop importing asbestos into the U.S. and then we really need to be serious about dealing with the legacy asbestos, enforcing past laws and regulations that are still on the books, and seeing if we need any new additional regulations and laws to protect workers and the public from asbestos.
Excellent. Celeste, don't hold back.
I cannot add anything to that.
Okay, that's unlike you. Well, I would like the members of Congress to know how much we appreciate their bipartisan work. And I know in the 116th Congress, they worked hard. And we hope that this next session in Congress will produce a bill that all stakeholders can get behind, to get behind a commercial ban of asbestos in imports, legacy study, and improved CDR reporting. We have very little time left. I want to leave with a couple quick things. I want to thank also the media. We have journalists on this this conversation, Mark and Celeste. If journalists don't take the time to follow ADAO and others, then our stories are never heard, shared, remembered. And I really am grateful that the media uses their pen to write this up, because it is a human rights violation to have all of this going on 100 years later. So thanks to the media. And thanks to the team behind ADAO. Sarah and Nicole worked very hard. Earl, Barry Castleman, I just see his name pop up. And Barry is an amazing person on our Science Advisory Board. Barry, I'm going to give you the last word, because you probably have some crazy t-shirt. If I can figure out how to unmute. Let's see. Barry, can you unmute yourself? Ask to unmute. Throw your camera on. Barry, you get the last word. Where are you?
Working on it.
Where are you? Talk to me, Barry. There he is. I love Barry.
Okay.
I hope you're not in your pajamas. I didn't embarrass you.
Well, anyway, well, we tried to ban asbestos in the 1980s, and we're still trying in the United States. And we need to catch up to the 70 or so countries that have already banned asbestos, and certainly apply what we already know to protect workers who are exposed to the legacy asbestos. Hopefully we've got a government in Washington that'll take that seriously, but it's always necessary for people outside the government to be pushing non-governmental organizations like ADAO and the unions to be pushing the government, even a receptive government, to do what it should and what it can to prevent preventable disease from toxic substances.
Thank you, Barry. And Barry's an expert witness and has written the legal and medical aspects of asbestos. I don't know what edition you're on, Barry, but he is an eminent witness and an expert that I rely on all the time. So thank you, Barry, for your leadership. That's it. We have run up against the clock. So I want to thank everyone for joining us, especially that many government individuals are on, from Maryland to state of Washington. I would say 30 to 40% of the people on this call are actually government officials that wanted to be educated. Mark and Celeste, thanks to your great work. So with that, I want to thank everyone, but most importantly, Mark and Celeste, you've done a phenomenal job. Mark will share your playlist of asbestos videos. Celeste, I hope everyone buys and reads your book. And Barry probably went to go get coffee. And I want to thank all of ADAO leadership for their support, and Earl Daughter and others. So as we say in my town of Hollywood, that's a wrap. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Linda. Thanks, ADAO.
Thanks, Betty. Bye, gang.